Welcome. I'm Ross Wiener, Executive Director of the Aspen Institute's Education and Society Program, and I'm just going to introduce this session very briefly and turn it over to Jim and Jonah. Before I do, I just wanted to say, following education policy over these last couple of years has really been quite a roller coaster. There's a tremendous amount has gone on, and I think we'll find out over the coming years what of it was productive and what of it we should have thought more about even at the time. But I think we've got a really unique opportunity to learn from what's just gone on in Illinois over these last few months and year, because it really is quite a different model than what we've seen. We saw so many headlines about Wisconsin and the sit-ins and the protests and just the really heated, polarizing nature of so many of the education policy debates that have gone on in the last couple of years. And Illinois really took quite a different tack, and it was sort of an all hands on deck. Everybody's in the room. We got to figure this out because we need to do better for our kids. And so I think there's really a lot to learn from, and hopefully I think there's an open question, but I think there's something hopeful about the kind of collaboration we've seen in Illinois about the possibilities now that it's time for implementation. So really excited to learn from these two folks who were prime actors in this drama. So we'll turn it over in a minute to Jim Crown, who is a trustee of the Aspen Institute and very involved in education and civic matters in Chicago, and Jonah Edelman, the co-founder and CEO of Stand for Children, an advocacy organization around improving public education that's sort of in 9 states across the country. Is that right? So we're thrilled that you're here. Thanks for coming to Ideas Festival, and I'll turn it over to you.
So thank you. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks everybody for being here. We put this forward as a education-centric session. This is really going to be an hour about politics and political action. So there might have been a little camouflage in the titling, because while the nobility of the outcome, we hope, is something that we can all be proud of, what you're really about to hear, what happened in Illinois, is a story of fairly straightforward, very rudimentary political activism, and it could apply to things other than education. In this case, it applied importantly to the educational system in Illinois and in Chicago, it really was thanks to Jonah and one other person that Illinois went from having one of the worst statutory environments for education reform to what is, we hope, a model for virtually all the other states. And while this subject might sound very local to some, education reform in Illinois, I think the Senate Bill 7 that was just signed by the governor a little while ago might well be regarded as the most important new model for legislative reform and education reform in any of the 50 states. I want to set the context before handing it over to Jonah to describe what we were up against and what the environment was. And the way to set the context really is to blend 3 streams of recent history because all these things are complicated. Let's talk about what the educational system looked like in Chicago. 675 schools, 122 of them are high schools. We have 71 charters. The school system is the second largest employer in the city with over 40,000 employees. About 25,000 of them are teachers, all unionized. The budget is fairly substantial. It's the third largest school system in the country. It has a $5.3 billion budget, and right now we're running a projected $700 million deficit. So those are kind of just bare facts. How is that school system performing? In a word, awful. People remember it as being a poster child many years back for the failure of inner city public schools. We have the shortest school day of any major public school system, and when Rahm Emanuel was running, he liked telling anecdotally the story of a kindergartner in Houston public schools and a kindergartner in Chicago public schools. By the time they receive their diploma, if they do, as seniors, the Houston public school student will have been in front of a teacher 4 years more than the Chicago public school. Imagine missing 4 years of face time with teachers because of the length of the school year and the length of the school day. the dire statistics go on. Less than half of the high school people who show up for high school graduate in 5 years, and only 8% of students who start as freshmen in a Chicago public high school will graduate a four-year college by the time they're 25. And if you're an African American male, that number is 3%. So think of the human capital loss when 97% of the African American males that start in the Chicago public school system have no statistical shot at coming out of a four-year college with a degree. Teacher quality, another very interesting statistics. Those of you that are close to academic institutions know that state schools, education officers talk about an ACT score of 20 is a kind of a floor for being able to succeed at a decent four-year college. The average ACT score of Chicago public high school teachers is 19. And that includes the up average we now have because we have a strong Teach for America core in those numbers. It was lower than that before TFA was folded in. So that's the school system. What was the political context? Illinois is, I think everybody's observed in the last couple of years, a pretty blue state, and a history of either liberal Democratic governors or occasionally governors who use the state house as a way station to federal prison. And either way, it has not had strong. It has not had strong executive leadership, and it has had a dominant voice from the well-mobilized and well-organized political action groups, including unions, and especially the teachers' unions, which are quite strong throughout the state of Illinois and in Chicago. We do have a very strong speaker, Speaker Madigan. Mike Madigan is probably the most powerful political person in the state, frankly, in terms of being able to make things happen. But he's a political pragmatist, and the unions historically have been very well mobilized politically to pursue their agenda. And they were always there in every campaign cycle, over $4.5 million of contributions going back to 2000. And they knew what they were doing and did it well over the time period. So basically, they had the best shot at writing the rules. So what did that give us? There actually is one more state in Illinois, one more state in the Union that is more strike permissive than Illinois was. Anybody want to guess what it was? Vermont. All of the public school students in Vermont would fit in 2 high schools in Chicago. But Vermont is the only state in the Union that had a more permissive strike regime than Illinois did. Now, there are a couple that were almost as permissive, Hawaii, Minnesota, and Montana. But people talk about right to strike. We reference Wisconsin and what happened there. It is a well-accepted political concept, I think, in this country. Firefighters, policemen, flight attendants. Some people have to mediate, can't strike, and in fact, in 45 of the 50 states, there is no right to strike by teachers. 39 have absolutely no right to strike, and 6 others require fact-finding first. So this was an incredibly strike-permissive environment with these other efforts by the unions and so forth that created a unsustainable structure in our school system. People might also, especially in this environment, be aware, we had a mayor who talked importantly about reforming the schools, Mayor Daley, and we had a CEO of public schools, Arnie Duncan, who did everything he could in that environment. But this was not a fair fight because of the political strength and the organized strength of the unions who, each time they came up to a contract session, would not concede on a length of day, would not concede on teacher metrics, and would insist on additional compensation, and that's the way things have gone for an entire generation in terms of negotiated outcome. One last bit of context before I ask Jonah to describe what we did with that circumstance. Chicago has a very engaged private citizen community that wants to make the city better. Those of us that live in Chicago are extraordinarily proud of how engaged and committed people are to civic leadership across all domains. This includes education. And education received a lot of funding, a lot of attention, and it was from virtually every corner that you could imagine. It was corporations, it was civic organizations, it was the private sector, it was foundations. But I feel like a lot of what we did there was, I don't want to make it sound marginal by saying it was at the margin, but it was something outside the core structure. It was not structural change. It was the charter schools. It was bringing in Teach for America. It was bringing specific programs of human enrichment as an overlay on what was basically there. And I have to say, working at the edge like that for some people was getting to be quite frustrating and frankly quite discouraging. I have a couple friends, they speak with a bit of hyperbole, but they will say things like, you know, I've put thousands of hours and millions of dollars into this, we have accomplished nothing, I'm done here. And were we really at an inflection point when Rahm Emanuel was elected? I don't know. Were we really at an inflection point when this bill came up? I don't know. But people were talking about it like, okay, we will give this one more shot with our philanthropic dollars and with our time, and if we can't get it right this time, I'm going to put my efforts and money into something where I can actually live to see the benefit, because people were quite frustrated with the benefit they weren't seeing up until then. So into that maelstrom walks Jonah Edelman. And you heard a little bit about Jonah. Stand for Children was organized in, well, I guess DC was the first place you worked, but it's based out of Oregon. And Jonah, through some mutual friends, approached several of us who had been working on this to talk about how he thought maybe he could help make things different. And he was quite persuasive that he could, and so we'll move to having him explain exactly what that was. I guess I just will give you a little bit of a commercial, because if you look at the website, it does have a rather moving phrase about where the name comes from, and it was a quote from Rosa Parks, who was part of your Washington, D.C. Event, who said, "If I can sit for justice, you can stand for children." And that is the credo of the organization. And Jonah, why don't you talk a bit about what you did?
Thank you. Thank you all very much for coming. There were a few positives I want to point out. Jim hit the political context squarely on the head. A few things that are also important to note. An organization called Advance Illinois, which some of you may know about, was founded a few years before Stan came to Illinois by the Joyce Foundation and the Gates Foundation. And it's a terrific organization led by a wonderful leader, Robin Staines. And it's very strong on policy advocacy. Had Bill Daley as the co-chair before he went to the White House, and Jim Edgar, the former governor. So that's a great asset in that state. And they had led a process, which was collaborative, to establish a better way of evaluating teachers. The catalyst for that was federal Race to the Top money, which you might have been aware of. Are you aware of the Race to the Top competition where Arne Duncan put together $4 billion, let states bid, great catalyst for change. And Illinois basically went as far as its politics would allow it by coming up with a new way of evaluating teachers. No consequences, but a good first step. And I think it's really important to mention. So coming to town, I was aware of that, and I was also aware of the entrenchment. And frankly, when Bruce Rauner, who's a mutual friend of Jim's and probably many of you in this room, who's been involved in education for many years, asked after seeing that we'd passed legislation in several states, including Colorado, that we look at Illinois, I was skeptical. And after interviewing 55 different folks in the landscape, Speaker of the House, Senate President, minority leadership, education advocates, met with Jim and many others, was very surprised to see that there was a tremendous political opening that I think Bruce wasn't even aware of. And that was that the Illinois Federation of Teachers, still inexplicably, went to war with Speaker Madigan, who Jim cited as a very, very powerful figure, who'd been Speaker for 27 years, with the exception of a couple of years between 94 and 96, over an incremental pension reform. And Jim and many others are diehard advocates for pension reform in Illinois, and the pension reform that happened in 2010 is not the reform that's needed in Illinois, but it was a first step, only affecting future employees. The union could well have, probably definitely should have, thanked Madigan for not going further. Instead, they decided that the $2 million they had been giving him reliably for election campaigns, that they would take that away. that they would refuse to endorse any Democrat who voted for that legislation, even those that had been loyal supporters for years. And they went to the AFL-CIO and tried to get them to do the same. So a major breach. And it's something, just as you're kind of starting to think of ways in which the context in Illinois is similar to other states, you're starting to see that in other states, where Democrats who are still in control are having to address these terrible fiscal issues, and in so doing, there's often conflicts that are arising. So there's this breach. And Stand, with the support of Jim, Brian Simmons, and a few others, Ken Griffin. Well, actually, initially, it was Jim, Matt Hulsizer, Paul Finnegan. We decided to get involved in midterm elections, which many advised us against doing because we're new to town, we don't know the landscape. But my position was we had to be involved to show our capability, to build some clout. So we very quickly researched the situation, and while there was a lot of folks, I think, who thought that the Republicans were going to take over in Illinois, our analysis was that Madigan would still be Speaker. And that was, district by district, dispassionate. That wasn't what I think a lot of our colleagues wanted to hear.
To put that in context, by the way, this was in one of the several spikes of Blagojevich indictment headlines. And so, no, seriously, as a political flow, you would have bet against people running in his shadow.
That's exactly right. And there's obviously a red wave last cycle. And so our analysis was he was still going to be in power. And as such, raw politics of it were that we should tilt toward him. And so we interviewed 36 candidates in targeted races. And essentially, I'm being quite blunt here. The individual candidates were essentially a vehicle to execute a political objective, which was to tilt toward Madigan. So the press never picked up on it. We endorsed 9 individuals, and 6 of them were Democrats, 3 Republicans, and tilted our money toward Madigan, who was expecting, because of Bruce Rauner's leadership, and Bruce is a Republican, that all of our money was going to go to Republicans. That was really a show of an indication to him that we could be a new partner to take the place of the Illinois Federation of Teachers. That was the point. Luckily, it never got covered that way. That wouldn't work well in Illinois. Madigan's not particularly well liked. And it did work. After the election, Advance Illinois and Stand had drafted a very bold proposal we called performance counts. It tied tenure and layoffs to performance. It let principals hire who they choose. It streamlined dismissal of ineffective tenured teachers substantially, from 2+ years, $200,000+ in legal fees on average, to 3 to 4 months, with very little likelihood of legal recourse. And most importantly, we called for the reform of collective bargaining throughout the state, essentially proposing that school boards would be able to decide any disputed issue at impasse. So a very, very bold proposal for Illinois, and one that 6 months earlier would have been unthinkable, undiscussable. Now, after the election, I went back to Madigan, and I reviewed the proposal that we'd already discussed, and I confirmed his support. He said he was supportive. The next day, he created an education reform committee, and his political director called to ask for our suggestions of who should be on it. And so in Aurora, Illinois, in December, out of nowhere, there are hearings on our proposal. In addition, we hired 11 lobbyists, including 4 of the absolute best insiders and 7 of the best minority lobbyists, preventing the unions from hiring them. We enlisted a statewide public affairs firm. We had tens of thousands of supporters. And with Jim's and many others stepping up, Paula and Steve, thank you, we raised $3 million for our political action committee between the election and the end of the year. That's more money than either of the unions have in their political action committees. And so essentially what we did in a very short period of time was shift the balance of power. And I can tell you there was a palpable sense of concern, if not shock, on the part of the teachers' unions in Illinois that Speaker Madigan had changed allegiance and that we had clear political capability to potentially jam this proposal down their throats the same way pension reform had been jammed down their throats 6 months earlier. In fact, the pension reform was called Senate Bill 1946, and the unions took to talking to each other about, we're not going to let ourselves be 1946'd again, using it as a verb. And so in what's called lame duck session in January, called lame duck session because some lame ducks are allowed to take a last vote for politically difficult topics, proposals. We made an attempt to do just that, and we weren't able to move our proposal. My analysis to Jim and others was that it went a little too far for Illinois. But as you'll see in just a second, it was an effective starting point because we started extremely, gave ourselves some room to come back. Senator Kimberly Lightford, who's been a reliable supporter of unions and in the middle of education policymaking, intervened. She has a lot of clout in the Senate. She helped elect the Senate President, John Cullerton, and she forced groups to the table. The unions were thrilled to come to the table and to discuss things that, again, 9 months earlier, they would not have been willing to discuss. And so over the course of 3 months, with Advance Illinois taking the negotiating lead, my colleague Jessica Handy, our policy director, in the room for every meeting, and Advance and Stan working in lockstep, and that unity is so important, that partnership, caucusing before every meeting, caucusing after every meeting, making plans. They essentially gave away every single provision related to teacher effectiveness that we had proposed. Everything we fought for in Colorado down to the last half hour of the legislative session, they gave us at the negotiating table. Not irrationally, not idealistically. It wasn't a change of heart. It's because they feared that we were able to potentially execute our collective bargaining proposal, enact that. And unions are very logical. They're concerned most about their dues and their membership. And then next up, collective bargaining, and pensions are somewhere right around there. And then teacher effectiveness reform, issues, tenure, layoffs, compensation, that's tertiary for them. So if you show the capability to actually enact collective bargaining reforms, they're logically going to give on everything short of that to pull back the barricades. And so this was the strategy, led by the IEA. And I should note, the Illinois Education Association, which is the downstate union, which is the better resourced union with more members, has a history of pragmatism. And they led on this negotiation. They really kind of brought the other unions along. Joe Anderson, the former head of the Illinois Education Association, now works with Arnie Duncan in the Department of Ed. And his son, Josh, is the head of Teach for America in Chicago. And the new director, Audrey Soglin, is very pragmatic. I doubt this tape will ever get to her, but I would say that I'm interested in talking at some point about whether or not she, at the end of the day, was happy to get these issues resolved. I don't think she liked defending a seniority-based system. So in the intervening time, Rahm Emanuel is elected mayor on the first ballot, and he strongly supports our proposal. Jim talked about the talking point that we made up, and he repeated 1,000 times probably on the campaign trail about Houston kids going to school 4 years more than Chicago kids. That was another shoe that dropped, and it really put a lot of pressure on the unions, particularly the Chicago Teachers Union, because they didn't support him. So here's what ends up happening at the end of the day. April 12th, we're down to the last topic of collective bargaining. It's been saved for last. It's the hardest topic. We fully expected that our collaborative problem solving of 3 months would end, and we would have an impasse and go to war. And we were prepared. We had money raised for radio ads, and our lobbyists were ready. Well, to our surprise, and with Rahm Emanuel's involvement behind the scenes, we were able to split the IEA from the Chicago Teachers Union. And in January, just after we hadn't gotten our proposal through in the lame duck session, I'd worked with a labor lawyer named Jim Franzik, who's absolutely brilliant, if any of you know him, and his partner of counsel, Stephanie Donovan, on fallbacks. And Jim and the other supporters had approved fallbacks from our initial proposal, essentially isolating Chicago and calling for binding arbitration or fact-finding process that wasn't binding but would have a high threshold for unions to approve. We came with a fallback of binding arbitration when we saw that the Illinois Education Association was willing to do a deal and just focus on Chicago. They, interestingly, pressured the Chicago Teachers Union to take the deal. Karen Lewis, the head of the Chicago Teachers Union, who's a diehard militant, was focused on maintaining her sense of her members' right to strike. Her sense was that binding arbitration was giving away the right to strike. But our next proposal, our next best, which was a very high threshold, 4 strikes, for whatever reason, tactical miscalculation on her part, was palatable. Rahm pushed it. Kimberly Lightford pushed it. We'd done our homework. We knew that the highest threshold of any bargaining unit that had voted one way or the other on a collective bargaining agreement on a contract vote was 48.3%. The threshold that we were arguing for was 3/4. So in effect, they wouldn't have the ability to strike, even though the right was maintained. And so in the end game, the Chicago Teachers Union took that deal, misunderstanding, probably not knowing the statistics about voting history. And the length of day and year was no longer bargainable in Chicago. And we insisted that we decide all the fine print about the process. She was happy to let us do that. With the unions then on board, they were relieved, the IEA and the IFT were relieved to have a deal. They came out strongly in support of this agreement, which was this wholesale, transformational change. And with that support, there was no reason for any politician to oppose it. So the Senate backed it 59-0. And then the Chicago Teachers Union leader started getting pushback from her membership for a deal that really probably wasn't, from their perspective, strategic. She backed off for a little while, but the die had been cast. She'd publicly been supportive. So we did some face-saving technical fixes in a separate bill, but the House approved 112-1. And a liberal Democratic governor who was elected by public sector unions, that's not even a debatable fact, signed it and took credit for it. So we talk about a process that ends up achieving transformational change. It's going to allow the new mayor and the new CEO to lengthen the day and year as much as they want. The unions cannot strike in Chicago. They will never be able to muster the 75% threshold necessary to strike. And the whole framework for discussing impact, what compensation is necessary, is set up through the fine print that we approved to ensure that the fact-finding recommendations, which are non-binding, will favor what we would consider to be common sense. So that's what happened. And we're really happy to open this, but we're talking about an opportunity now for transformational change across Illinois, in that principals will have the power to dismiss ineffective teachers, that they'll be able to hire who they want, that they'll no longer be forced to accept teachers they don't want in their buildings, and that when layoffs happen, they'll be able to let people go based on performance, not just seniority. And then in Chicago, they'll be able to lengthen their day and year, which has been just a horrible inequity for decades. And all this with the narrative of union leadership. Because it was a fait accompli, and the unions decided smartly that they would pursue a win-win. We gave them the space to win. We've been happy to dole out plenty of credit. And now it makes it hard for folks leading unions in other states to say these types of reforms are terrible, because their colleagues in Illinois have just said these are great. So our hope and our expectation is to use this as a catalyst to very quickly make similar changes in other very entrenched states. That's the overview of what happened.
Jonah, thanks. So I'm going to make 4 summary points, and then we will throw it open to questions and dialogue, and be very interested to hear how people are reacting to this based on where you're coming from. Observations I would make are that obviously special interest politics are alive and well in America, and the point isn't whether they are good or bad, it's whether or not they're well organized, well funded, and have a noble goal. But this was special interest politics. What was unusual, I think, is that there was actually never a special interest advocacy group that was focused on pro-children education reform. There was not a special interest for that cause. And that one did develop was instrumental. Also, obviously, this had to be a financial and political priority. We all have our political priorities when we go to the ballot box. It can be taxes, choice, regulation, the role of government. This seems to be important to everybody, but not a decision point for what candidates they really back. And until that happened this election cycle this way, it was going to be like complaining about airline food. Everybody may do it, but unless you change your choice of airlines because of it, they're not going to change their food. It's going to be price and schedule, which data shows people react to what the customer actually is asking for. And the last thing I'll mention, and this was a bit of the epiphany that it occurred, at least for me and some others that were very much a part of this effort. Jonah's mentioned several, but not all. We were very proud of what we were doing as a family in Chicago, as a philanthropy, as citizens, but we had to take our fight where the fight was. We had never gone to Springfield with these issues. You know, principals, schools, mayors, yes, but we had never gone where the fight was. And I think until you take this to where the fight is, you're going to end up with the cycle that we endured for a generation and the frustration we did. And so we're very pleased that we finally got cracked the code on that one. So with that, love to hear your questions and comments. Yes, right here.
Can you talk a little bit about how you'll define success and in what increments you'll measure that for improvement?
For us, it's college-ready high school graduation. And then, you know, leading to that, it's children who are on track. Now, we're going to get into broader topics of the problems in American public education here. But it's opaque. You know, there's just not enough clarity about who's on track and who's not. Every state defines their own graduation standards, and they have their own assessments. You know, I think one of the things we could do collectively that make the most difference is, in whatever way you can, ensure that the Common Core standards, common standards across the country for high school graduation are implemented, and that the assessments that go along with those standards are executed and they go into effect. And there's a common definition of a kid who's on track and who's not, and more transparency. That's the bottom line, but the statistics that Jim cited have to change. If they don't, then what we've done has accomplished nothing.
Right here.
You're still facing a $700 million budget default. Is the group holding together to attack this issue across the SPICs, or have you moved on to other issues in the city and stuff?
Okay, I'm not sure who the you is in that sentence.
The political group.
Oh,
Stand for Children in Advance Illinois. You can speak.
Absolutely, we're building an affiliate for the long term. We have a great staff already. There has to be a statewide constituency of parents and educators, and there has to be a very, very proactive strategy in Chicago and outside Chicago. Our first focus in Chicago is going to be ensuring that district is able to follow through on the instructional time increase. Now, while the rules allow the mayor to increase instructional time, it can't become something that's a terrible issue for him politically. So we have to organize and mobilize the support to make it a winner politically. So we'll be there to support the mayor in that. We also want to get parents engaged in the topic, because top-down change only without an educated group of consumers only goes so far. So we're hoping to have tens of thousands in a discussion around how time should be used in Chicago, so that when the mayor comes forward, be it September or next spring, to enact a longer day and year, that there is a community groundswell of support.
But you still have a $700 million bogey, and if the Washington, D.C. example, it can get very, very difficult in a Chicago-type community to ram through cutting teachers and all the other kinds of stuff you're going to need to get to the bogey.
You are right to predict some more turbulence on this topic, and it's hard for us to see, just as citizens of Chicago, how they're going to solve this. We've got a new school board, we've got a new CEO of public schools. They are working this, they're disaggregating it, and they've figured out 15 million here and 22 million there. It seems to me like we will end up operating in the red for a while. I'm not quite sure how that works as a matter of cash management, but they have got a serious uphill problem, and the they in this case is the school board and the political administration, and how the mayor is going to deal with that is a front and center problem that I don't, he will get it down, he won't get it to zero, and that may create some, you may be hearing about this topic again because of that, and trying to lengthen the day with paying people, while paying people no more, is obviously going to stress things.
Just one follow-up. Is the private sector become really more important now than they even were in the start?
My forecast is in the immediate term, this is now back in the mayor's court and the school board's court to start getting some things in place about principles and metrics and quality schools and so forth at the CPS level. Right after that, I think the public sector or the private sector has got a great partnership opportunity to come in and do things that will be effective and strategic once this is sorted out. But the ball's on the other side of the net right now for the mayor to get stuff done before we can come back in as private citizens and truly be helpful, I think. Yeah, right here.
Two questions. Do you have any curricular reforms planned based on the new Common Core standards because of your newfound power?
The question was about whether or not there are curricular reforms, and that's really not been something that.
No, I mean it's something we've encouraged state boards of ed in some states to adopt the Common Core standards, but you know, the lead group on that is Achieve, and they've done, and the chief state school officers and the NGA, they've done some great work on it. So STAND isn't involved at that level.
And the second question, that's okay. Tennessee recently enacted a collaborative conferencing model to do negotiations. I was wondering how you felt about that.
I was just in Tennessee a couple weeks ago, and I think there's big questions around how that'll play out. Obviously, you want a balanced negotiation process where a threat of a strike can't take issues off the table, and where management needs to have some discussion, so there's some ownership and buy-in on the part of the workforce. And I'm eager to see how that works. I'm also, I also think there's some possibilities of enacting similar improvements in urban districts in Tennessee as a result of the contract change.
In the back.
Hi. I'm wondering how optimistic you are about scaling this to states that have very, very entrenched union. I'm from New York, and I was listening to your whole battle plan and wondering if you think that either your organization or others can go to a place like Albany and get private philanthropy to partner with you to see the kinds of reforms that happened in Illinois and other states like New York.
Yes, for sure. I mean, I think it's a question of resources, skill, and then unity. I think those are the key ingredients. New York already has a good group called Education Reform Now, and I think there's another group that I can't mention that may come in with even more forcefulness in New York. And so for us, it's really a question of niche and need. If we're invited there, if there's a group that really wants us to come and there's a niche, we're open to it. Illinois has very entrenched politics. There's really no, I mean, there might be a degree of difference with California, probably is the worst, and then New York, but it's really the same.
You don't want to be in these playoffs, even if you're not going to win.
Yeah. So Massachusetts, we have 9 affiliates, and we're growing to 20 states by the end of 2015. The calculus is always the same for us. It's about whether there's a near-term education reform opportunity, niche, champions, ability to scale and sustain. We're not here to come in, pass a law, and leave. The questions have already been asked. This is about long-term change, and it's from capital to classroom. So New York is certainly a state we could work in if there were a need. The key in New York is you're not going to change the speaker of the assembly. Okay, the question is whether or not you can get 2/3 support. And so just as you saw an incredible transformation on gay marriage in New York that just happened, basically the same legislature, different result because of better political strategy and execution. The same can happen on education in New York.
What's the future with pension reform? Is that going to be next? That's really the biggest.
For those that like feeling better about their state finances, Illinois has a $113 billion unfunded deficit due to these unfunded entitlements. We are held up against, per taxpayer, the worst. It held up against the ability to generate revenue, the worst or one of the worst. And we tried, we meaning the state, to go after this in a sort of, I would say, moderate, intense way before the legislature adjourned. The votes were not there, and they said we'll try and do it over the summer session. So it was deferred for lack of political capital to get it done. Whether or not it's deferred further, I don't know. What's happened more recently is that the tax increase that occurred in January, we raised personal and corporate income taxes significantly, has resulted in at least an announced, whether it's threats or actual, I don't know, but it's an announced flight of corporate headquarters that has had Governor Quinn every day hosting a new corporation, cutting a special tax deal for them. And so we still have got a lot to sort out on the balanced budget in Illinois, and the political will is not yet organized enough to get something done. Yes?
I have two questions. Number one, I'm from D.C. We saw this happen with Fenty putting a lot of what you guys were about. He lost his election because he was unable to distinguish what the fact that employment meant for teachers and what kids' rights were. And essentially, the electorate saw that employment opportunities were being taken by this mayor. What public relations strategy did you use in Illinois to distinguish the fact that kids needed to have a better chance of their future as opposed to folks who had no business being on the payroll, stay on the payroll?
First of all, I don't agree with that being the reason why Fenty lost. I think that's, I would disagree with that premise. I think
It was a substantial reason, though, within the city.
Fenty could still be mayor of DC easily. All right, and politics is an art.
Why do you think that? Yeah.
Politics is an art form, and I think when you read accounts of reformers or elected officials who try to rule by fiat, and do things without practicing the art of politics, which is labor-intensive, relationship-based. I'm from DC, and I know a lot of people there, and I think you got to go to funerals. You got to meet with people. You got to meet with people who backed you. You got to put people in key positions who are going to treat people respectfully. And you don't do that, you pay a price politically. And he could have done all the educational changes, even in the way that they were done, which really could have been more diplomatic, and still won had he done his business politically. That being said, our issues poll really well, actually. And that's our theory of action, is to focus on issues that the public strongly agrees with, but special interest politics have prevented from happening. And use, as Jim said, special interest politics on our side. Our theory of action doesn't work on issues that don't poll well. And so, and again, we don't come in with a one-size-fits-all to a state, and we don't come in, with our finger pointed, ready to poke people in the eye. Our approach is build as much political clout in the most unassuming, diplomatic way, go for bold change, do it in the most bridge-building possible way. If you see a leader like Audrey Soglin, give her the ability to lead. Give her the space to win. And don't, play win-lose politics. Unfortunately, Washington, Oregon, California, you got to play win-lose politics because of the way the unions operate. So you can't be shy about that. But it's just operating in a fairly disciplined, strategic way at all times, and not saying things just because you want to say them. They feel good to say, but they actually aren't strategic when you're trying to achieve a political result.
And secondly, do you see any future for your organization within Vincent Gray's administration in any type of educational?
We're not working in DC. There's a good group called DC School Reform Now that was founded by one of our board members, Kristen Airgood, that I think very highly of, and we provide some technical assistance. And DC has some great opportunities. I think Kai Henderson's a terrific leader. I think Mayor Gray that is very open. They have an incredible opportunity with their charter sector in DC. I mean, it's got some real scale, and if they get their quality issues under control and close some of the bad charters, you could see a lot better results. It could potentially be a model.
Right here.
I'm Shai Cowper with the Seed Foundation. What you all did in Illinois is just brilliant. And I'm trying to think about the scalability issue and trying to drill down a little bit more on that, because you're not going to find a scene between a unbelievably powerful Democratic speaker in the teachers' unions in other states, although it would be great. But the big thing you said, that you sort of said it so matter-of-factly that I think is huge, is you raised $3 million for political contributions that exceeded what the teachers were putting in that given year. One, can you talk more about that? Because
Jim should talk more about it. I mean,
that's huge.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
what are states, if you can name some, where you think the lessons of Illinois could be replicated?
Sure.
And finally, just a quick other one. Well, I heard what you said about the teachers unions, having to sign on, but they got weak knees, but it was too late. What are they saying now? Are they sticking to their support after the fact?
Absolutely. So the last question first. The IEA and the IFT are thrilled They're writing op-eds in national publications about, Illinois being an education reform leader, not mentioning Stanford children. That's fine. And that's great. It's a great narrative. The bill signing was, I was saying to Jim, it was a great example of politics in action. Stanford children was hardly mentioned. Many of the fathers of that success who were absent for the conception and gestation and birth of the child, were claiming credit for paternity. It was terrific, and that's how it works. So I think this is an enduring change, and the implementation is going to be quite smooth. And the CTU president probably is going to have some trouble, based on putting herself in a position where she's got a terrible reputation now in Springfield, and now she's also has some trouble internally. So she's got some challenges.
I guess the comment I'd make about the $3 million is that this was just straightforward pragmatism. I mean, holding aside value judgments or social objectives or any policy conversation, what are the facts? You've got well-organized teachers' unions who have political campaign chests. They have workers who show up in meetings who are mobilized to do what is in their interest. And that is an absolutely standard, conventional, appropriate factor in American politics. There was no counterweight. There was no organized force to have a rational legislator say, well, these guys are helping me in my district, and you guys are giving me lectures about 3% can't go on to college. I realize that, but my issue is getting elected because I'm not going to solve all these problems between now and November. And so the pragmatic response is, we get it. You would like to stay in office, and you would like to stay in office backed by people who then you can pursue that agenda as long as you're finding alignment. So forget the rhetoric, forget the speech making that we would all do, and say, okay, we will have money, and it will go to you if you're backing this as a political priority, and it will go to the opposite of you if you're not. And
Jim, what was your calculation? For you, it was a departure.
Yeah, there's a high squirm factor in doing this, right? First of all, you'd like to think that the merits of the argument are compelling. And second of all, candidly, this is a fraction of what we've all spent on charter schools and scholarships and all these other things. But it was, it added up to $300 million, and it was hundreds of thousands for many of us. And it was all of a sudden check writing that we said, okay, we get it. The outcome here won't be new computers. It will be this person will be in office, not that person. And you just had to choose that as the path you wanted to be on.
And we can't do it in other states. We're already getting going. The thing about the way we work is we're doing this level of work in every state that we're in. And so it's not one person. It's significant organizations led by stellar executive directors who operate as CEOs. So in Washington State right now, we've got exactly the same goal, and that's another state where it doesn't lack for financial resources. The question is, achieving the same kind of reallocation. We could readily outspend the Washington Education Association. Massachusetts, very similar. It might be a ballot measure in Washington. It might be we have a ballot measure on the ballot and we use it as a lever in Massachusetts. But it'll look a little bit different, but it's essentially the same. Iowa is another state. Democratic Senate. I feel like we could do the same very, very major reform potential there. So I don't think there's any question, but by the end of this decade, we're going to have ended seniority-based decision-making in education in this country. That's not enough to ensure better outcomes, but it's certainly something that has been long overdue.
Yes.
I was just wondering, in terms of thinking about this as a model of scalability, as a component tied in with all the other reforms, what do you expect the timeline to be for results in Chicago or in Illinois that result from the changes that you've made?
Well, I think the soonest they're going to be able to make their year longer and their day longer is the soonest would be January, and it's probably we're talking September 12th. And then, if you have a longer day but terrible teachers, that doesn't do anything, right? So it's about performance management. It's boring. It's not a silver bullet, but Jean-Claude Brizard needs to hire a lot of really good, what they call chief area officers. He's got to hire a lot of really good, like superintendent level people. They'd be overseeing 30, 40 schools. And then they've got to evaluate their principals rigorously, and they need to create much more in the way of pipelines of quality principals. So it's blocking and tackling. But now there's, as Jim said, a more conducive framework for folks. And I would think that more people would want to be principals, because then they realize they actually not only have the accountability, but they have the authority.
Yes?
So do you want to have the accountability back to you that happens? I mean, what role do you play? You've invested in all this.
Well, okay, so the U now shifts to a citizen of
Right,
Chicago,
as a citizen.
or and these dire statistics, which I'm glad they seem to have some shock value in this room. They've actually had much steadily diminishing shock value, and people are just accepting these bad numbers and outcomes as though, well, the weather's tough in January too. Yes, we would like, we are interested in the transparency, we're interested in the metrics, we very much would like to see this happen, but there's no single organization that can or should feel, this is all of us, as a citizen of Chicago or a citizen of the United States, as Jonah said a minute ago, this conversation pertains to our future as a country, our financial well-being, our national security, and all these things are just going to meld together. If this gets better, we'll be glad that we were part of helping getting it a little better. Okay, and you're our last questioner because we're coming to the end of our hour.
My last question is, what was the role of media in this process? Generally speaking, you try to bring the media on board with you to support you, but this sounds like it was a much more underground based.
No, I'm glad you asked that. The Tribune was fantastic. The Tribune was I think they probably wrote, more than 10 supportive editorials? Prominent, like, top, well-written. I think Paul Weingarten was responsible for a lot of those. Sun-Times was good. We had a lot of downstate editorial support. It didn't become a big flashpoint, and so on the news side, it didn't get so much attention. It did, after it passed, get a lot of attention. But editorial support was terrific, but I wouldn't call it anywhere near a decisive variable. But it's much better. Wisconsin was a problem for us. It made it hard for a while, but we were able to reframe by doing a side-by-side, which we sent to all legislators, juxtaposing our legislation from the Wisconsin legislation to make clear that the union's mantra of "this is a Wisconsin-style attack" was baloney. But it was definitely this is in a charged media environment, so I think I'd say to come out with this kind of kumbaya narrative was even more notable, given the main story of polarization in the country.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.